So what I'd like us to do right now is I'd like us to take a look at this brain here, which gives us 8 neurodevelopmental constructs, or what we call learning pathways. These are 8 areas that play an important role in all of our learning. Many of you may have seen some of these terms. Some of you may not be familiar with all of the terms. But what I'd like you to do right now is I'd like you to look at the terms and think to yourselves about what you know about these terms. And then I'm going to ask you to think about the task that we just completed right now, the Chumash task that we just did. I'd like to ask you to think through and to use your chat feature to let us know which of these neurodevelopmental constructs, these 8 different terms down here, which one of them or many of them did you use in order to complete the task that we just did. So please use your chat feature to let us know, just naming them, which ones of the 8 neurodevelopmental constructs listed here did we use in order to be able to complete this Chumash task. Okay, what I'd like to do is I'm going to start with an example of one of the constructs that we might use from this list. So what we have here is, on the top, sequential ordering. In order to complete this task effectively, we would have to use sequential ordering. How would we use that? So we'd have to understand the sequence of directions given in order to complete them. For our paragraph to make sense, we'd have to sequence the ideas and sentences in a logical order. What happened first, then next. In reading the words in psukim, we'd have to know that we must follow the order provided in order for it to make sense. And lastly, we had 90 seconds to complete the paragraph, and one of the biggest sequences that we have in life is time. Now, I see that we have a couple of additional comments from those of you who chimed in, and we appreciate that. What we have here is sequential ordering, language, memory, and attention from Yael. From Rivka, we have language, memory, higher order cognition, and neuromotor function. From Dahlia Weiss, we have all of them. From Maggie Silver, memory, language, higher order cognition, and attention. Thank you for chiming in. What I'd like to do now is just to look at each of these that you've mentioned and to come to a greater understanding of how it is that these were used in order to complete that Chumash task. So let's begin. We did the sequential ordering, as we mentioned a moment ago. Let's look for a moment at spatial ordering next. So spatial ordering with regard to the task. So how do we actually use the Chumash page? How are we understanding it by way of the space? How are we going to organize the essay on paper? How are we going to use our page effectively and be sure to be able to get as much as we can on it? How are we going to visualize what it is that impacted us in our life and how it relates to the task at hand or the essay that we're about to write? On the neuromotor end, there's the graphomotor piece. I don't know if anybody had guessed. Rivka Denberg had mentioned neuromotor. There's the graphomotor piece. We had to write in order to be able to accomplish this task. Writing is part of the graphomotor area, which falls under neuromotor. With regard to memory, which I see a number of you included, we have long-term memory. We have to relate back to what it is that we know in order to be able to address the task at hand, and in order to be able to talk about what a relationship is that we had to these psukim. We have active working memory. We want to hold on to the concepts that we're working on in our heads and move on and be able to write the essay. We have to be able to remember the writing rules and the punctuation. We want to remember the spelling and the ideas, all while we're engaging in the task. Active working memory there means holding on to something at the same time as you're pulling from your memory. So you're engaging in a task and pulling from your memory all at the same moment in time. On the attention end, which I see that Maggie Silver had included, we want to focus on directions, focus on the task at hand. We have to have enough mental energy to be able to complete the task. We want to focus on the important details versus the unimportant details, both in our essay and in the psukim themselves. We have higher order cognition. Rivka Denberg and Maggie Silver had mentioned those. There's creativity. What are we going to create? We have a blank page. How are we going to create something out of it that's meaningful? There's brainstorming, ideas that we're going to be able to put together. There's logical thinking. How are we going to accomplish the task at hand? There's problem solving. How are we going to problem solve ourselves through this problem of, this is the task. How do I get myself through it? Then there's the language piece, which is an extremely important piece here. There's receptive language. We have to follow directions. There's expressive language. We have to be able to put our ideas down on paper. There's phonology. We have to be able to read phonetically correctly. There's semantics. There's understanding of vocabulary. There's syntax, which is understanding how sentence structure works, both in terms of understanding the Chumash and in terms of writing the Psukim. And then there's discourse, which is the ability to be able to write more than a paragraph, being able to write an essay, for example. There also is the social cognition piece here, which isn't as relevant when it comes to working over a webinar because you're all sort of hidden from view. But in a classroom, if we were to do a task like this, there's a social cognition piece here where kids might be concerned about the student next to them and whether they are writing as much or whether they can handle the task as well. So the social cognition piece will play out in your classrooms. What I'd like us to do right now is I'd like us to look for a moment at our own strengths and struggles. I'd like us to take about 60 seconds to analyze how you yourself personally did and what your strengths and weaknesses are in relation to this particular task that we did. So look through these questions for 60 seconds and think to yourself how well you did with these questions. Were they strengths for you or were they weaknesses for you? Was it easy for you? Was it difficult for you? If you notice in the parentheses, it gives you an explanation of what some of the neurodevelopmental demands or constructs you might have been using in order to complete these pieces. So in order to follow directions, you might have to be using sequential ordering or receptive language. So for yourselves, you might get a sense of how strong or weak or what your strengths and weaknesses are with regard to these particular constructs. So 60 seconds, take a look. We're starting now, and just get a sense for yourselves of your own strengths and weaknesses. Fifteen seconds left. Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do now is I'm going to ask you, of the 8 neurodevelopmental constructs listed below, which are the ones that we just covered, and the only ones, which 2 would you say were the most required in order to successfully complete the Chumash task that we just did? That's to say, without capabilities in these 2 areas, it would be extremely difficult for you to complete this task effectively. I'm going to ask you to use your chat feature now to share with us which 2 of these you think we sort of can't live without in order to complete this task. Okay, very good. So we've got a number of responses here, and we see here language and higher order cognition, language and neuromotor, language and neuromotor, language and neuromotor, language and attention, language and attention, language and sequential ordering. Okay, so there always will be, and there forever will be, disagreements of about exactly which ones would be most necessary in order to be able to complete the task. But without a question, language definitely won. Every single person who listed, certainly one of them listed language as an absolute. Without language capabilities, it would be near to impossible to be able to complete this task effectively. We have a number of neuromotors, some attentions, and some sequential ordering. Again, there will always be a difference of opinion. However, if this is a writing task and we're asking you to put down an essay and you cannot write, it might be difficult for you unless you have a computer in front of you. But yes, attention will be important and sequential ordering will be important too. But it is important for us to always think through and try to understand within the tasks themselves, there will be many areas that are covered, but which are the ones that are really most relevant and most important in these tasks that we're giving over? Because when we have students that might not have strengths in those areas, it'll be difficult for them, particularly if they're so paramount within the session, within the lesson that we're trying to teach. Now, each and every task that we assign or lesson that we teach incorporates and impacts our numerous learning pathways. Our own personal profile of strengths and weaknesses interacts with the information that comes our way to create a learning experience. That experience can either add to our understanding of the world or conversely, it can have little positive impact. For example, for some of us in engaging in this task, the language component matched well with our agility with words. For others, getting the words out right was with great difficulty. And so it goes for all the task demands and constructs involved. It's the difference between catching the ball versus having it hit you in your head. All students have continuously developing neurodevelopmental profiles with strengths and weaknesses in the various constructs. Just as no two people have identical handprints, so too the profile package of strengths and weaknesses found within two people are not the same. There are times where a student's profile aligns nicely with the demands of school, but there are other times where a mismatch occurs, making it difficult for those students to learn. As a facilitator of students' learning, a teacher is responsible for being sure that the lessons taught align well with the students' learning profiles. Our aim as teachers is to find the best match between our students' minds and the construct demands of the lessons that we're attempting to teach them. In order to effectively find this match, we must begin by taking the time to reflect on the minds of the children that we're educating. This requires a teacher to step back and think through what they know about how each of their students best learn. With the teachers that I work with, I recommend that they do two different things in order to be able to take that time to reflect. One is I do ask the teachers that at some point during their day, either on their commute to school or on their commute back from school or in any way, shape, or form, to take one student a day to think about what they know about that student, what they know about how that student learns, what they know about that student's strengths and weaknesses. And the next day, another student, just to take the time to reflect on their students, to get an understanding of who they are and what their strengths and weaknesses are. At the same time, it's important to also step back as a teacher to take time to watch the students in whatever capacity, in whatever way we can. You know, sometimes when we're actively engaged in teaching in a lesson, we think to ourselves, how are we supposed to be able to find time to actually notice what it is that a student is capable of doing or is having a hard time with? But it really is our responsibility as teachers to find that time, to step back and to look at our students and really think about what we know about them and or what their observable behavior, what we observe in them, so that we can get a better understanding of them. The next step in finding this match involves taking the time to analyze the task demands of the lessons that we're aiming to teach and understanding which of the neurodevelopmental pathways are embedded within that lesson. This is what our aim is today. This is what we're going to do. So we're going to begin now by spending time looking at various Chumash lessons for the neurodevelopmental demands that are embedded within them. And we're going to start by looking at some of the standard techniques that are used for teaching Chumash. So this is the goal of the following third grade Chumash lesson here is that children will be able to read and demonstrate understanding of two new psukim in the curriculum. Let's take 30 seconds now to read the following instructional strategies to yourselves that the teachers will use in order to accomplish their goal. Okay, so this is a fairly standard Chumash lesson that you might find in a second or third grade classroom. What we'll do now is we're going to try to look at which neurodevelopmental constructs are represented in the lesson above. And we're going to do this by breaking up the task into its fine components. This is the exact same thing as written on the previous page. Truthfully, those 4 numbers shouldn't have been previously written. It really should have been written in a paragraph, but for whatever reason, that's how it ended up happening. And we broke it down into the 6 different aspects of what took place. Now, if you can clarify for yourselves what you're actually, obviously what your goal is, and then what you're actually going to do with your students, you can do this with your own lessons. So what we're going to do is we're breaking it down into their components, and we're going to look at each of the components to try to get an understanding of what neurodevelopmental demands are being used or embedded within each of these pieces. So let's look first, finding the proper perek and pasuk in the Chumash. If you can use your chat to help us understand which of these components would be used in order to be able to accomplish number 1, which neurodevelopmental demands are used to be able to find the proper perek and pasuk in the Chumash. Okay. So we have some responses here. We've got sequential ordering. We've got spatial ordering. We've got language. Did I see language? Sequential ordering, spatial ordering, sequential ordering, spatial ordering, attention, spatial ordering. I'm not sure. I don't think language was there. I'm not sure if language was there. In any case, yes. So we're looking at spatial ordering, sequential ordering. We may be looking at the ability to be able to maneuver your finger, move your finger in the right place, which seems sort of very minor, but for some it might be difficult to be able to track with their finger. That might be a fine motor or neuromotor task. We've got, someone did say language here. Okay. So that's to be debated, whether language is included in this, but finding the proper perek and pasuk in the Chumash for sure involves spatial, sequential, and neuromotor. Next, pointing in the Chumash while following along as the teacher reads. If anyone can chime in and let us know which neurodevelopmental tasks are involved in number 2. Neuromotor and spatial, neuromotor, spatial, and attention. Okay, very good. Next, students listen to teachers translating a pasuk. Which neurodevelopmental demands would be included in number 3? Attention. Language and attention. Very good. There's receptive language there. Language and attention. Attention and language. Okay, great. Next, attention and language. You guys are good and consistent. Okay, next, students copy the new vocabulary words from the board into their notebooks. What would we say is included there? Which one of these neurodevelopmental constructs? Language and neuromotor. Neuromotor and spatial. Neuromotor, spatial, and attention. Neuromotor and spatial. Okay, very good. What I do see missing, however, from one of these lists here is I see short-term memory is missing. In order to be able to copy words from the board into your notebook, you'd have to be able to look up at the board, hold on to the information, come back down, and put something in your notebook. So if you notice that there are kids in your class who have a hard time copying from the board, it might point to the copying itself, obviously. The handwriting might be a neuromotor. Spatial is the ability to be able to copy over those letters in a way that you're using. The letters are actually just shapes in space, so be able to copy over those letters in an effective fashion. Attention is certainly being used, and somebody did write memory, I see. Okay, memory is there. Short-term memory, to be able to hold on to it and bring it and retain it for those few seconds to be able to get it back into your notebooks. And number 5, children read the psukim when called on. So reading psukim, what would we say that is? Memory, social language, attention and memory, language and memory, language and attention, the ability to be able to understand how to be able to read and recognize a letter or a word that might enter spatial ordering even. Higher order cognition, okay, that's interesting. I'd love to. I wish I could hear from you what you mean by that. And how about sequential ordering? That the psukim go in a particular order, and we need to be able to follow that order. Okay, and lastly, children each translate one of the psukim out loud. So which constructs are we using there? Memory, very good. Certainly memory is being used. Memory, attention, and language. You hit it on the nose, whoever you were. Okay, Tova Reitzek. Okay, so thank you very much for all of your responses. They can keep coming in, and what we're going to do is we're going to notice on the next page that nearly everything that you said, for the most part, was put together here on this nice little chart, which you should have for yourselves or will be sending you to be able to keep track of your own sessions or lessons that you're going to be teaching or that you intend to teach. And you can yourself break down the tasks into your own separate components and compartments, and you can notice which of the different constructs are being used. If you look here, we notice that there are two constructs that really stick out a little bit more than the others. One of them is a double-checked one. Now, why I'm double-checking is because it's like the question that we asked you a few moments ago. Without this, you couldn't possibly be engaging in this task. So I double-checked it just to emphasize it, to show that without receptive language, you'd really have a hard time listening to the teacher translating the pasuk and understanding it. You'd have a hard time with phonology if you'd have a hard time reading the pasuk if you had a hard time with phonology, and you would have a hard time translating the psukim if you have a hard time with receptive language, with expressive language. Morphology is the ability to be able to break words up into its root or its prefixes or its suffixes, with semantics, which is vocabulary, with syntax, which is the grammar rules and things of that nature. And the other piece here you'll notice is there's 5 checks for the box of attention. So there's really a very strong attention component in this task as well. So we have the language and attention seem to be, even though we do see spatial ordering is impacted to some degree, sequential ordering is impacted to some degree, neuromotor to some degree, attention, memory to some degree, but attention and language are really very strong. And I think if we look through the answers that you gave, which we can't do right now, but if we would, we'd likely find that attention and language came out very strong by you. Now, students with strengths in language and attention would probably do best in that last session. Students with other strengths in other areas would have greater difficulty. Please know that if we utilize the same format for teaching our lessons day in and day out, and this format does not work for a particular type of student, that student will suffer terribly in our classroom. What can we do to help students who are struggling with a particular type of lesson that we're trying to teach? As a facilitator of students' learning, a teacher must consider alternative lessons to achieve the same goals. In our Chumash lesson, our goal here is that children will be able to read and demonstrate understanding of 2 new psukim. Now let's look at 2 alternative lessons that can be used to accomplish the same goals. Each of these lessons will tap and include a different variation of constructs so that depending on the student's strengths and weaknesses, they will gain from the lessons in different ways. Now, I'm only offering you 2 alternative lessons, and I'm not necessarily saying that these lessons are the ideal lessons. My only point is to try to show you that if you use different lessons, you will accomplish different things with students who have different neurodevelopmental profiles. So let's take a look for a moment at alternative lesson number 1. Children use tabs to find the proper, so the goal is the same. The lesson goal is the same, but these are the ways the teacher is going to accomplish that goal. Children use tabs to find the proper parak and pasuk in the parsha. Students are asked to highlight words in the verses that they're already familiar with, and the teacher writes the translations on the board. A conversation ensues about the meaning of the unfamiliar words, with students guessing what the words mean based on prior knowledge. New vocabulary is written on a separate area of the board. Students listen to teachers translating the pasuk phrase by phrase using vocabulary on the board. And the children practice reciting and translating the psukim to each other in chavrusa, first using the words written on the board and then without. Chavruses help, encourage, or correct each other. So you'll notice, we can't put these two pages on at the exact same moment, but you'll notice that the neurodevelopmental demands of this task are different than the neurodevelopmental demands of the previous task. Here we are including a little bit more of a higher order cognition and a social cognition. In the prior task, there was really very little. I know that there was somebody who mentioned there was higher order cognition used. Again, I'd love to discuss with you where you saw that, but there really was very, very little higher order cognition going on in that previous session. But for kids who might have social strengths and or the ability to be able to think at a deeper level, a session of this nature might be better for them, better suited for them. Now you'll notice that yes, language is still a strong component, and I can tell you that in the next lesson, language will still be a strong component. But the question is, can we even it out a little bit also and give other areas a little bit of a fair share in terms of being able to access this particular task? So if we look down at the bottom for a moment, we'll see that when it comes to the bottom task, this task of children practicing reciting and translating psukim to each other in chavrusa, first using the written word on the board and then without, and they encourage and correct each other, if you look, you'll notice that so many more of the neurodevelopmental constructs were actually being utilized. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 out of 8 constructs that are being covered there. And we might want to consider at times trying to engage the students in activities where more constructs are covered in a fairly even way. Again, language is very strong and will be strong because this is going to be a language task if we're trying to understand psukim and express our understanding of those psukim. But if we can even it out and give the ability to other constructs to be able to be covered within a particular area or task, that will certainly help students. I'd like to look for a moment. Now, we're not going to go into full depth in discussing all of these, but you certainly have them available to you, and I think based on the tasks that we just did, I think there's a greater understanding that you might have about how to actually break up each of these components into their neurodevelopmental constructs. Let's look at alternative lesson number 2. In this lesson, the teacher tells the story of the psukim. The teacher recites the psukim 3 times together with their translation, and students repeat the verses. Students work in small groups, choosing from a variety of options to demonstrate their understanding of the psukim. In all 3 instances below, which we'll get to in a moment, the children must use accountable talk to show how the psukim relates to their presentation. So there are times where children might be asked, let's say, to write a skit based on the psukim. And it's a free-for-all. Just, write whatever you want. But what we're doing here is we're actually asking the kids to use accountable talk. And what that means is if you decide to include something in your skit, you have to point to somewhere in the pasuk or show in the pasuk why it is that you're including that in your skit. There has to be a rationale and a reason for it. Obviously, at the level of the neurodevelopmental level or the developmental level of the kids in your class, that's how you'll be working it out with them. The sophistication level and the ability to be able to be accountable with their talk at the 8th grade level will be very different than at 3rd grade level and certainly at the 2nd grade level. But accountable talk is something that you can teach. It's something that they're learning in the English curriculum now, and it's something that the students really are gaining from. So there's 3 different instances or things that they can use below. 3 tasks. One is to write a skit based on the psukim using relevant concepts. The second would be drawing a picture or creating a model to illustrate their understanding of the psukim. And the third is to talk about a real-life connection that can be understood through the psukim. One thing that you'll notice is that if you look at the bottom, you'll see that every single construct is tapped here. These 3 different tasks, where you're giving students the ability to make a choice and choose which one of these things they'd like to engage in, theoretically speaking, could include any of these tasks and any of the neurodevelopmental constructs listed below. And it's important to be able to think through, notice, what is the difference between the task that I might have given that first task, and what is the difference between the second task in the neurodevelopmental constructs, and what are the task demands for this third task? As much as we can try to change things up for these students and give them the ability to be able to taste the information and the material in different ways, the better off they'll be. Now, you might have a question, and that question might be, is it really possible that we're going to accomplish the lesson goal of the children being able to read and demonstrate their understanding of the 2 new psukim from this particular session. What I'd like to ask you to do now is to look at the session and look at the goal and use your chat feature or your hand, maybe even better, to raise your hand if you think that this particular lesson can accomplish the Chumash lesson goal. Is it possible that this lesson would accomplish the goal? You can either say yes or no with your chat feature or raise your hand to say yes. I see one yes. 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 Anybody out there with a no? Yes. Everybody's saying yes. Wow, we have a sophisticated group of teachers here. Not sure about the reading part. Oh, very good. I had the same question myself. You're good. Mordechai Silverberg, he picked up on the one issue. Okay, so what I'd like to do now for one moment is I'd like to think about the following two questions in relation to this particular task. Something to think through. Now, you might have already thought about this, but just something to think through. Sometimes we think that when a child can translate a pasuk, that they actually understand the pasuk and that they know what the pasuk means. So we want to think to ourselves sometimes, just because a child can translate, does that actually mean that they understand? And it's something to think about in all of our lessons. Whatever lessons we give, sometimes there's this concrete sort of desire to have our students be able to spit back information to us and give it back to us, but we're not really clear that they actually understand what it is they're giving. They might have a decent memory, they may be able to spit back, but do they actually understand? And certainly we want to make sure that our children have vocabulary down so that they can use their vocabulary in future places within Tanakh. But we want to think to ourselves about where we can find a place for tasks that will help students expand their thinking and understanding in a different plane, and where we can find a place for activities that will utilize other neurodevelopmental pathways for understanding material. So how is it possible to individualize all of our lessons to suit the needs of our students? After all, isn't there only one of us in a classroom? How are we doing this? So let's look at some strategies. What we're going to do is I'm going to give you a very brief a very brief description of these strategies, and then we're going to go into them in a little bit more of a fuller way. So some strategies for differentiating in our classroom. One would be peppering our lessons with new tasks involving numerous neurodevelopmental constructs, which is really what we've been talking about until now. The second would be introducing an element of choice into classroom activities. And the third would be working cooperatively in groups or pairs. So let's develop these a little bit more fully. Strategy one, peppering the lesson. So let's try our best as teachers to try to pepper our lessons with tasks that impact more than the same few neurodevelopmental constructs so that we can offer variety within the lessons that we teach. I gave you here a number of different ideas that you can use within your own classrooms. I can tell you that in addition, we have a Hidden Sparks Judaic Studies Guide, which you should be getting in a separate link from this particular webinar, where there's a lot of different options of different tasks that you can do and the constructs that are embedded within that task. So you have an understanding of what those tasks actually are. But here, I separated them out for you, just giving you some ideas. We'll just mention a couple of them, broken up into the constructs. So, for example, in spatial, if you notice that there's kids in your classroom that have particular spatial strengths, you might want to ask them to create a picture book about the content. Or you might want to use graphic organizers or encourage them to use graphic organizers. You want them to be able to, you might want to ask them to draw shirashim definitions on flashcards. Is that for everybody? Not necessarily, but there may be some students in your classroom that would work effectively with, so you might want to include that. You might want to use maps and artifacts, pictures, whatever you can do on a spatial end to be able to help those students who have strengths in those areas understand the material in that way. Memory, you can use memory matching games. You can teach Shirashim through song. You can create key rings. There are many, many different ways to be able to help students improve their memory of information in your classroom. In higher order cognition, you can help students connect ideas. You could ask students to connect ideas that they have learned in other places to concepts that they're learning now. You can ask them to relate their learning to their personal life. You can have them keep record on classroom walls. You can keep record on classroom walls of important questions that they've asked, and ask them to think through for themselves what Rashi's question might be. On a neuromotor end, you might have them use hand motions to correspond to definitions of shorashim. You might have students use art projects to display their understanding, or writing activities related to the Chumash. On the temporal sequential end, you might ask them to relay the sequence of the story that takes place in the Chumash. You might want to use timelines to help clarify for them the sequence of events or the sequence of what takes place in the Chumash itself. You might want to keep that timeline on your wall and add to it as the year progresses. You might want to show them how Parsha, influences the timeline and how it corresponds to what it is that you might be doing in Chumash. You might want to give them advanced warning of information that will involve sequences. On the language end, you might want to share the story of the psukim in advance. You might want to create charts of prefixes, suffixes, and root words and leave them on your walls. You might want to give them verb charts, vocabulary walls. You might want to have Judaic dictionaries available or reference books for them to go back to. On the attention end, you might want to ask students to identify the main idea of the psukim. You might want to ask students to discuss a topic in the Chumash for a few minutes straight and see if they can do that. You want to involve them in as much movement and hands-on activity as possible, which certainly decreases the burden on attention, and develop activities that vary in rate, moving students from one activity to another. On the social end, as much as we can engage the students in cooperative work or in any work that involves socialization in the classroom, if there are strengths, they will thrive in that classroom. We can have students identify thoughts and feelings of characters in the Chumash in order to be able to understand the social aspects of the Chumash. And if you like, again, like I said before, there's further resources in the Hidden Sparks Judaic Studies Guide, which should be coming to you. And there's lots and lots of activities there and broken down into the particular tasks. So you can use them to be able to enhance your own classrooms in whatever way to pepper those lessons and to be able to bring in more constructs into your lessons. Strategy 2, the element of choice. So if we introduce choice into our classroom tasks, allowing students to determine which activities work for them, the children will more easily find the right fit for their learning style. Let's talk about choice for a moment. Here we have a quote from Benjamin Franklin: "Tell me I forget, teach me I remember, involve me and I learn." There was a 2008 meta-analysis of 41 studies that found a strong link between giving students choices within the classroom and their intrinsic motivation for doing a task, their overall performance on the task, and their willingness to accept challenging tasks. Giving choice is an excellent thing to do in a classroom. However, researchers warn, don't give too many choices because that can confuse and overwhelm. So we want to give choices. We don't want to overwhelm, however. Here's one nice way of being able to give choices in our classroom. There's something called a choice board, which you can get lots of material off the internet about, and it's something that you can certainly use within your own classroom, where you might want to have a board where you list a number of different options that the children can choose from in order to be able to show their understanding of the psukim. So here are just some examples. We can interview a character in the Chumash, asking at least 4 different questions. You could have students taking turns or pairing up to be able to do this. We can draw or find a picture that connects the storyline in psukim and write a caption. We can go through the psukim and create a timeline of events listed in the parasha. Based on the students' desires themselves and what they know that they're good at, they will be drawn to one of these areas or to more than one of these areas. And if you want to challenge them and give them something that they can try that's maybe with a little greater difficulty, you might ask them, if you did this last time, I want you to try something else this time. What else would you choose from this list? Also, one thing that you should understand is that when students have organized choices in the classrooms, they do become better problem solvers, are more creative, and are more engaged. So, the idea of giving students choices and children choices in general is a great way to help them develop. The strategy 3 is cooperative learning. We want to allow children to find their own voice in their learning by giving them opportunities to work in pairs or groups, utilizing the very strengths that they bring to the table. So let's look for a moment at just some Judaic sources for Chavrusa and Chabura learning. Now, the reason why I'm bringing this in is because it's fascinating that Chavrusa and Chabura learning is a part of our history, and yet oftentimes we'll find students in classrooms sitting lined up straight, working independently, doing their own thing, and without the realization that the chavrusa and chabura learning is a part of who we are. And sometimes even when I'll mention it to teachers, why don't we try chavrusa learning, even at younger ages, 3rd grade, 2nd grade, even at 1st grade, there are ways to engage the students in chavrusa learning. It's like a little bit of a surprise to some of the teachers sometimes. Like, how do you do that? And I think there's this feeling that as the students get older, maybe they can engage in chavrusa learning, but when they're younger, it may not work. So let's just go through some of the sources, the Judaic sources, and then we'll look through some of what research has to say about cooperative learning. So based on numerous stories and statements in the Mishnah and the Gemara, chavrusa learning was an essential feature of yeshivos during the time of the Tanaim and Amoraim. The rabbis repeatedly encouraged their students to have a study partner. Rabbi Yossi ben Chalata told his son Rabbi Abba that he was ignorant because he did not study with someone else. In Bava Metzia 85b, a conversation between Rabbi Chia and Rabbi Hanina is recorded. Rabbi Chia indicates, my methodology of teaching will have the effect that Torah will not be forgotten from the Jewish people. What was his method? He described the lengths in which he went to get parchment to write the 5 Chumashim on. Once they were written, he described teaching 5 children, 1 of each of the Sfarim of Chumash, and 6 children, 1 of each of the Siddharim of Mishnah. He then instructed his students to teach one another the Chumash and Mishnayos that they were taught. Rabbi Yehuda Hanafi commented, great are the actions of Rabbi Chia. The Maharsha in the story explains that each one of the 11 children would be a learner and a teacher, and that this is the loftiest level of Torah, and in this way, Torah would not be forgotten from Yisrael. So there is a particular technique which we will discuss in a couple of minutes called the jigsaw, and it seems as though maybe Rabbi Chia was the inventor of the jigsaw. I'm not sure. I imagine that probably was the case, but it's precisely what it is that Rabbi Chia recommends. We'll get to it in a couple of minutes, but it's basically the concept of students each learning a particular area and then going to the others and teaching them what it is that they're experts in and what they know. In Brachos 63b, Ein HaTorah nechnes ela b'chabura, Torah doesn't enter except in a group. And in Pirkei Avos it says that one of the ways to acquire Torah is with dibuk chaverim, learning amongst friends. These are just some Jewish sources to be able to help us understand the value of learning the chavrusa and chabura, which is also called cooperative learning. Now, cooperative learning in the classrooms is just based on research. Students benefit from the coaching, encouragement, and feedback from their peers. Learning moves in cooperative learning from teacher-focused to student-focused, allowing the students to be more actively involved and engaged in their own learning, and the responsibility then lies in the hands of the students. If we go back to the very beginning of the presentation, where I had asked you to take some time to step back and reflect on your students, you can much more adequately do that when it is that the students are actively engaged in the learning and when the spotlight is not on you. So the more that your students can be working cooperatively, the more you can step back and watch them and notice who they are as learners. Teachers are able to spend more time working with individuals and small flexible groups to target specific skills or topics that students need reinforcement with. So in cooperative learning, it frees the teacher up to be able to work individually with those kids who need particular areas of work or groups of students that need reinforcement in different areas. The social interaction during cooperative learning supports cognitive function, lodging learning experiences into sections of the brain that causes the memory of those learning experiences to be stronger than if learned alone. Cognitive rehearsal, clarification, and reteaching all take place when working with others in groups and has a positive impact on academic achievement. Students can discuss new concepts with someone close to their own level of understanding. They get to try out new ideas and ask questions in small groups before speaking to the whole class or finishing a written product. And when students discuss and defend their ideas or solutions with group mates, they learn to think problems through, support their own opinions, critically consider the opinions of others before drawing a conclusion, and higher order cognition is strengthened in classrooms where cooperative learning is used. Let's just look for a couple of minutes now at some of the cooperative learning techniques that we can use within our classrooms. So cooperative learning can be broken up into 2 different types. One would be the informal cooperative learning activities, and the second would be formal. So let's just talk about the informal first. So informal groups are made of small ad hoc groups of students that work together for a short amount of time, often less than or up to a class period. Informal groups are useful for breaking up a lecture into shorter segments interspersed with group activity. So you might be lecturing, and in the middle of your lecture, you'll engage them in one of these following activities. While the methods lead to less time for lecture, it'll increase the amount of material retained by students as well as their comfort level in working with each other. So let's just discuss 3 different types of informal cooperative learning activities that you can use within your classroom. Think, Pair, Share, I think, is the one that's probably most commonly used. I imagine that some of you might use it, but we'll explain for those who don't know what it is. And that is where a teacher asks a discussion or a thinking question. The students are instructed to think about their answer. They then turn to their peer, and they talk to their peer about what it is that they think their answer might be, what their response might be, and then together they share those responses with the whole class. It's a way to be able to break up that lesson and give the students the ability to be able to think for themselves and cooperate with each other for a short amount of time, and then you draw them back into the lesson afterwards. Next would be peer instruction, where a teacher poses a question that's typically a conceptually based multiple choice question. The students think about their answer, they vote on their response, they then turn to their peer to discuss what it is that they felt the answer could be. They certainly can change their answers if they feel that they want to. What ends up happening after is the teacher then shows the graph of the student responses to the group, and a discussion happens where the class can discuss what it is that they think, what most of the kids thought and why, and a group discussion can occur. It works very, very well in larger classes. And the last piece another informal technique that we want to use for cooperative learning in our classroom will be the jigsaw that we spoke about with Rebecca, where groups of students work in larger teams to become experts in one particular segment of the new material being taught. These expert teams work with materials that the teacher might have given them. The teacher can spend time working with them, but they're all working together. Each of these expert teams are working on something else, but all at the same time. They should have hands-on materials to work with because obviously a teacher cannot be available to each of them at the same time, but the teacher would cycle through and spend a little bit of time with each of these groups. The class is then rearranged after they learn that material. The groups are now reformed into other groups where one expert from each of those teams is now present in one group together, and the members each take turns sharing their new expertise, the things that they learned with the other kids in the group. So the student is then learning and then teaching, like the Marsha talks about with regard to Rechia's way of doing things. The teacher obviously cycles the room, monitors progress, and evaluates the group for individual performance. Next, we have some formal cooperative learning groups. In these formal groups, the instructor defines the learning objectives for the activity and assigns students to groups. The groups are usually heterogeneous with particular attention to the skills that are needed for success in a task. So we want that group to be made of different kids with different capabilities so that that task can get accomplished. Within the group, students are often assigned specific roles, with the instructor communicating the criteria for success and the type of social skills that will be needed. For example, some of these roles might be reader, translator, questioner, recorder, sense maker, listener, encourager, researcher, summarizer, timekeeper, and each of these roles are defined for the students in a clear fashion so they know what it is that they have to do. Clearly, it can be any role that you might add to it. Teacher plays an active role during group work, cycling the room, monitoring progress, and evaluating the group and individual performance, and understanding the students' strengths and weaknesses, each of their own. And the teacher takes time at the end of the period to encourage groups to reflect openly on their interactions and to identify potential improvements for working together more effectively. In these formal groups, students work together for one or more class periods to complete a joint task or assignment, and they work together for an extended number of weeks. Now, we did have a webinar that's archived in the Hidden Sparks Without Walls website from Harriet Lenk, which goes into much greater depth into cooperative learning. It's an excellent, excellent session. I would recommend it for anybody who's interested in doing some cooperative learning groups. You can take certainly from what we have today. There's a tremendous amount of material also on the internet with regard to cooperative learning. It's definitely a very, very important component to add to our classrooms. Let's just review some of the things that we discussed today. There are 2 steps involved in matching our lessons to our students' neurodevelopmental profiles. As teachers, we really need to take the time to reflect on the minds of the students that we're educating in order to gain an understanding of the way that each of our students best learn. As teachers, we have to also consider the lessons that we teach and identify the neurodevelopmental task demands that are embedded within each lesson. We can then effectively match the student's strengths and abilities to the lessons that we teach. We can use this information to motivate us to move away from teaching our lessons in the same format day in and day out, and to try instead to use a variety of techniques and tasks to teach the material that we're trying to impart. We can learn to pepper each of our lessons with tasks that will impact more than just a few neurodevelopmental constructs, offering variety within the lesson itself. We can introduce choice into classroom tasks, allowing students to determine which activities work best for them and their learning style. And we can encourage students to find their own voice in their learning by giving them opportunities to work in pairs or in groups, utilizing the very strengths that they bring to the table.